Hi everyone and welcome to this assessment briefing webinar aimed at supporting you with completing assessment 7015 as part of your CMI Level 7 Coaching and Mentoring Certificate. I'm Karen, an Associate Coach and Learning Facilitator, and I support Boo Coaching and Consulting in delivering CMI coaching and mentoring programs. So the aims and objectives of this session are to help you understand the learning outcomes and assessment criteria of your assessment, understand how to structure and present it, know where to start with your research, and then also how to manage your word count. So for this assessment, there are 3 learning outcomes. Firstly, you need to be able to demonstrate the links between strategic performance of the organisation and coaching and mentoring. And then you need to show that you understand the impact of culture on coaching and mentoring. And then the opposite, so thinking about how coaching and mentoring can impact your organisation. Each learning outcome is broken into a number of different assessment criteria. You need to be able to pass all of the criteria in order to pass the assessment. The criteria cover both coaching and mentoring. And one of the things you really need to pay attention to are the command verbs that are within the assessment criteria. So it's usually the first word in each assessment criteria. So here you can see the command verbs are identify, demonstrate, develop, and conduct. You can find details of the command verbs in the Coaching and Mentoring Candidate Handbook. If you go to page 34, you'll be able to find them all listed here, and you can find the definitions. So you'll see that they actually differ in terms of complexity, and some of them are actually sort of higher order command verbs, so they're asking a bit more of you. So an evaluate, for example, is looking for you to consider pros and cons for an argument and then draw a conclusion, whereas something like an identify is asking for less detail, really. So when you're addressing the criteria, try to back up your work with your wider reading and examples from your organisation that really show your understanding, and try to stick to what the criteria is asking for so that everything that you write is relevant to it. The learning outcomes and the assessment criteria are organised into an assessment brief. This is to make it easier to address the assessment criteria. You may find that the assessment criteria from different learning outcomes are organised into one task, as they are with this assessment. It'd be really helpful to start your assessment with a brief overview of your organisational context, and this won't be included in your word count. If you don't have an organisation you can write about, you can use the scenario that's provided. For this assessment, you should also include an introduction to coaching and mentoring, so using a recognised definition from your wider reading. So for example, you could use the definition from Whitmore or Megginson and Clutterbuck, or even from your textbook that we've provided, so the Pecora and Connor. You'll find it very helpful to refer to the syllabus whilst completing your assessment, as it gives you lots of hints and tips with good practice guidance as to how to address the assessment criteria that you can see here in this column. It is a really big document, but if you search for the assessment number, you'll soon find the right section for your assessment. So let's have a look at the individual tasks. So the guide word count for this task, so task 1, is 1,100 to 1,300 words. And if you have a look at how many criteria we've got 7 assessment criteria here. So if you divide that up by the total word count, it gives you approximately 185 words per assessment criteria. There are a number of assessment criteria that you can readily join together. So where it covers the same thing but it relates to coaching and mentoring, you can put those assessment criteria together, but just make sure that you've got examples for each. So for 1.1, you're asked to identify the links between individual, team and departmental performance objectives. and organisational strategic performance objectives. So you might find it really useful here to start with a definition of what we actually mean by a performance objective. You should be able to use your wider reading to find a definition of performance objectives. And what you could do here is think about how your vision and mission of your organisation threads all the way down to departmental and then team performance and then all the way to individual performance. You could use something called the golden thread principle to help you here to back this up. You'll find Management Direct really useful because what they do here is they actually map the assessment criteria to the content. So I've got an example here, and this just shows you how you can find information on some of the models that are listed in the syllabus. So this is all about the golden thread model. So I'm not going to cover it here, but it is quite useful, and it does show you how the golden thread links the vision and mission all the way through to individual performance. Sometimes when you're presenting your work, you might want to include some diagrams as well, and they won't be included in your word count, so you just need to make sure that you're referencing them as well if you're using an external source. So once you've identified the links between individual, team and departmental performance, you now need to demonstrate how that all links to coaching and mentoring. And here, essentially what you're doing is providing a rationale for coaching and mentoring as a development approach. And you can find lots about this in your wider reading and in the textbook that we provided. So thinking about things like how it might support team development, how it might help individuals overcome challenges, how it might be used in maybe change management, maybe using induction, how that it might help develop your senior managers and executive team, and so on. So there are lots of things you could talk about here. So thinking about the rationale for coaching and mentoring. Again, you can join these next two criteria together, so 1.4 and 1.5. What we're looking for you to do here is develop a case that coaching and mentoring can benefit your organisation. So here what you want to be doing is outlining the key benefits of coaching and mentoring, and there's so many that you could write about. So thinking about benefits to the coach, the coachee, the line managers, maybe mentors that are involved, thinking about the benefits to the team and then the overall organisation. So all sorts of things that you could write about, including things like the impact on retention, increased productivity, how it can help in change management, how it might be able to help with things like succession planning or knowledge sharing, all of those sorts of things. So there's lots written about the benefits of coaching and mentoring. So once you've outlined some of the benefits, what you now need to do is conduct an actual cost-benefit analysis. If you're not sure what one of those is, you can have a look at Management Direct for a really good example. So here's an example of a really simple cost-benefit analysis on Management Direct. It'll just help you understand it. You could lay it out a little bit like that. So some of the costs you might want to consider are things like staff time, the cost of training, any administration costs, for example, things like maybe housekeeping, maybe if you are publicising your initiatives, maybe doing some advertising, using the intranet, etc., you might want to include those. It is sometimes difficult to put an actual pound sign against some of the benefits, but there are ways you can do this. One of the things I would suggest that you do is actually watch the webinar that we've produced on return on investment, and there are some additional articles. For example, the Manchester Review is a really good source, so you might need to do some reading, extra reading on cost benefit analysis, and then also have a look at that webinar. So the final two assessment criteria in Task 1 are 3.1 and 3.2, and you can join these two together and just make sure you separate out any examples that relate to coaching versus mentoring. One of the things you might want to do here is define what is actually meant by performance management, and some really good sources for describing performance management are the CIPD and also ACAS. So you can maybe think about including a performance management cycle here. So cycle might consist of maybe planning performance, so setting smart objectives. Think about then how you develop people. Then how do you go about ongoing monitoring of performance and reviewing performance? And then finally, rewarding performance. So think about how coaching and mentoring might be used within each of these stages to help people improve their performance. So particularly in processes like appraisal or supervision processes, it might be helpful. So let's move on to task 2 now. So the guideline for the word count is 900 to 1,000 words, which isn't a lot considering what you've got to do. So there are 6 assessment criteria here, so it gives you roughly 165 words per assessment criteria. And you can join some of the sections together as well. So if you have a look at the first part, so 2.1 and 2.2 could be joined together because they're both asking you to look at how organisational culture can impact on coaching. I think one of the main things you could do here, just to start off this section, is include a definition of what we actually mean by organisational culture, and it's usually defined as the glue that sort of brings everything together, and it can be defined through the informal processes and practices and more formal processes too. And there are lots of different contributors here that you could refer to, and these are all listed in the syllabus. The one that I find really helpful and most useful in this particular section is the Johnson & Scholes Cultural Web Model, and you can find this on Management Direct. Here you'll see that the model breaks down culture into these 6 areas, and I think this is quite useful because it gives you some structure in which to write about culture, and it can give you some subheadings which will help you expand on your answers here. This particular part of the assessment can be quite challenging, and it's one area where sometimes we do see some referrals. And it's mainly down to covering the assessment criteria in enough depth and also paying attention to those command verbs as well. So I'm going to talk about those in a little bit more detail. But when you're doing these assessment criteria 2.1 and 2.2, you might want to think about describing what the culture is like in your organisation at the beginning, thinking about things like what the power structure's like, what are the control systems, thinking about your values and the behaviours, thinking about your leadership style, and these are listed in the syllabus. So the remaining assessment criteria for task 2 are asking you to evaluate the cultural influences that might inhibit and support both coaching and mentoring. For these assessment criteria, it's better to group the ones that relate to coaching together, so 2.3 and 2.5, so that you can cover coaching separately to mentoring. And then group 2.6 and 2.4 so that you cover mentoring in enough depth and separately to coaching. And here you're looking to evaluate. So remember these command verbs. So evaluate is to look at both the pros and the cons, the things that support, that inhibit, and then draw a conclusion. And just make sure that you cover both of these in enough depth. So remember, if you're covering 2 assessment criteria together, you need to make sure the word count reflects that. So it would be double the 165, so 330 words approximately if you're covering both 2.3 and 2.5 together, for example. And some of the cultural influences that you might want to talk about could be covered using the cultural web model that we mentioned before. So these are things like power structures within the organisation. How is your organisation structured? Where's the power held? Is it at the top? What are the rituals and routines that might take place there? So these can be informal things or less formal things. What are the control systems? So what kind of industry do you work in? Is it quite regulated or non-regulated, etc.? So just making sure that you give enough different examples, and I would say at least 4 different examples for each area here would be helpful. So let's move on to the final task, task 3. So you've got 1200 words here. So because there are 6 assessment criteria, you've got roughly 200 words per assessment criteria. So a little bit more of an allowance here. So for 3.3 and 3.4, what you're doing here is determining why it's important to get board level endorsement for coaching and mentoring. So why is it important to get your senior leaders involved? And some of the things you could talk about here is that often, obviously, senior managers hold the key to financing decisions on coaching and mentoring programs, and they really set the tone for behaviour, don't they, across the organisation. And you could think about the importance of senior leaders being good role models who perhaps value coaching and mentoring and actually participate in it. And then hopefully the rest of the organisation is likely to see the same value in it. And often things like thinking about goals are often set at the most senior level, and so it can be really important for your senior leaders to be involved and understand the contribution that coaching and mentoring can make. And if you don't have your board level endorsement of coaching and mentoring, well, what is the impact of that? Then it's unlikely to be really effective and truly linked into your strategy. Looking at 3.5 and 3.6, here you need to think about how coaching and mentoring can support a range of development issues. So what you need to be doing here is drawing examples from your own organisation, so including at least 4 different examples of how coaching and mentoring can support development. So thinking about things like continuous professional development, and if you're not sure what continuous professional development is, or CPD, have a look at some research on this, do some reading. A good place to look is a CIPD, you might find that quite helpful. And thinking about how coaching and mentoring can support lifelong learning. So other things you could think about, other examples are around maybe behavioural change or supporting career development, or even things like problem solving or team development. But you really need to give some specific examples of how coaching and mentoring can support these different development issues. So the final 2 assessment criteria relate again to culture, and it's also an evaluate type of question. So you really need to think about the pros and cons and the effect of coaching and mentoring on the culture. And it's the opposite of what we looked at before. So before we were looking at the impact of culture on coaching and mentoring, and this time it's the other way around. So you're thinking about the effect of coaching and mentoring and what that has on your organisational culture. And you need to include at least 4 possible effects that coaching and mentoring may have on your culture, and also just to evaluate those as well. It can be quite hard to evaluate the impact, but there are ways that you can do this. So have a look at the webinar that I mentioned before on return on investment. So some of the things you might think about are how can coaching and mentoring impact on things like engagements, for example. So you might have an engagement survey that your organisation does that helps you with some evaluation figures. Other such effects that you might be able to measure are things like the impact on retention and reducing employee turnover. So you may have some figures that you can find to help you evaluate the actual impact here. There might be other impacts such as increased sharing of good practice and sharing knowledge and skills, or improving networking. So whatever the examples are, just make sure that you've got enough and you've covered them in sufficient depth, thinking about pros and cons in terms of the impact on organisational culture. So now that we've covered the assessment criteria, we talked about the 3 different tasks that you've got to complete and what kinds of things you could cover in each of them. Let's just briefly talk about how to go about carrying out some research. It can feel a little bit overwhelming sometimes about where do you look, where do you find all the different sources. Well, obviously we provided you with the textbook, and I think this is a really good textbook. So Coaching and Mentoring at Work by Connor and Pecora is quite a useful place to start. And also don't forget to log into Management Direct and remember that they've mapped all of the assessment criteria to some really helpful resources within the website. And you can also have a look at the book lists that we provide at the back of the Coaching and Mentoring Handbook. So you can find the reading list on page 45 of the Coaching and Mentoring Handbook, and there's some good resources there. So my top tips with your research are to try and avoid relying on too few sources, but also don't overwhelm yourself with a huge amount of reading that's going to prevent you from getting started with your assessments. So maybe what you could do to get started is just research one topic at a time, take one or two assessment criteria together. Something else just to mention is to avoid quoting things like Google or Wikipedia, and just try and make sure that you find a reliable source. So let's talk about the structure and the presentation of your assessment. You can find a checklist as to what to include with your assessment in the Candidate Handbook. So this information can be found here on page 23, and it asks you to include a cover sheet, and here are the details of what you need to include there, a contents page, and then right at the end of your assessment you'd have your bibliography and your referencing, and if you can include on each page a footer so it's got these details in, so just make sure that you, before you submit, that you've got all of these things all tidied up really in your assessment. So try and keep your structure really logical. Just use the order of the tasks within the assessment brief to help you structure. And one of the things I usually do if I'm writing an assessment is set out the headings in advance, and just make sure that you've got lots of headings and subheadings. It really helps the assessor know how you're addressing the assessment criteria. And make sure you're breaking up your large paragraphs and don't have them too big. Just have one key point per paragraph. And things like diagrams and tables can really help where it supports your work. It might help you with word count as well, but don't forget to reference these. Try not to overuse any tables and diagrams so that you're actually avoiding putting it in your word count, because that will be picked up, but you can use them where it's necessary. Don't forget to include an introduction, as we mentioned earlier, so an introduction to your organisation and the context that you're writing about. And for this assessment we asked that you include a definition of coaching and mentoring. You don't need to include any appendices, and if you do they won't be marked as such, but if you really do want to, they won't be included in your word count. When you're writing, just try not to write in the first person using I, unless you actually include in a reflection, which isn't needed in this assessment. And just try and really write in plain English, and don't pad out your assessment with just waffle. And don't forget to proofread and sense check your work, and obviously spell check and grammar check your work as well. And really try to avoid paraphrasing too closely from sources that you've used, because it can look like plagiarism. I'm going to touch on referencing in a moment. So before we talk about referencing, let's just touch on the word count. I have mentioned this throughout. So just try and budget your word count so that you know roughly how many words are needed for each of the sections. And the introduction and context for your organisation isn't included. So if, for example, you've got a 1,000 word count for one of the tasks, and you know there's 6 assessment criteria, roughly then breaking it down into 160 words per section. And do make sure you allow for any areas where it asks you to go into more depth, so for example where it asks you to evaluate rather than just identify. Try not to use too many words on one criteria and too few on another, and take out any repetition, and really do try and stick to the word count. You can maybe use up to 10% more, but if you're over 10%, it may be returned to you. If you're less than 10%, you've probably not covered it in enough depth. So some of the elements that aren't included in your word count, so I've mentioned the job role or introduction to your organisation wouldn't be included. If you've included things like an index or a contents page, those won't be included either. And things like diagrams and charts and graphs aren't either, and your references and bibliographies aren't either. So I'm just going to briefly mention referencing because we've included and we've created a separate webinar that covers referencing. So please make sure that you watch that one because it goes into a lot more detail. You can also find some information on the CMI website. There's a referencing guide on there which goes into quite a lot of detail. But the key things are to remember that all of your external sources need to be referenced, and try to use a recognised referencing system where you can. You won't be penalised if you didn't use, say for example, Harvard style referencing, but it is just good practice, and the webinar that I've mentioned does cover that and how to use it. Try to use the original source in your references where you can as well. So we've reached the end of this assessment briefing. Hope you found it useful, but just a quick reminder, really try and stick carefully to that assessment criteria. So this is what you're going to be assessed against, and try not to veer away from it, stick to the point. Make sure you pay attention to those command verbs, so whether it's evaluate or identify or describe. Make sure you have a look at what those all mean, and that's in the candidate handbook. Make sure you're backing up your work with your examples from your reading. And again, don't forget to reference those, and also examples from your own organisation. And the syllabus will really help you. It does give you lots of ideas as to the different theories that you can include, different models, and just kind of what kind of content to include under each of the assessment criteria. Don't forget to budget your word count so you're not going over or under. And best of luck! Thanks for listening to this assessment briefing. If you need any more help, you can get in touch with us using the email addresses that you've been provided with, and we'd be happy to help you. You have some drop-in sessions that you can join, so do find out when those are, and we'll give you some more help with them as well. So good luck.